Hello, it's Jim Edlin with some thoughts on this week's lesson from the Foundry Publishing, January 4th, 2026, entitled Being Salt and Being Light, Being Transparent. It's a great lesson for the first week of the year. This world could use a little more salt and a little more light and some transparency. Our focus scripture is Matthew 5:13 through 16, and then again another set of verses in 6, 1 through 4. These are a couple of passages from Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. They're not very long, but certainly worth our pondering. The session truth is that as disciples of Jesus, everything about our lives should point to Him. What we hope our students will take away is that they will find ways to draw attention to God and not themselves as they live their lives for Him this coming week. Verse 16 of chapter 5 is the key verse. In the same way, let your light shine before others, that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven. For those of you who grew up in a Sunday school department, you may be thinking of a children's song, This Little Light of Mine. Do you remember how it goes? This little light of mine, I'm going to let it shine. I'm going to let it shine. I'm going to let it shine. Hide it under a bushel? No. I'm going to let it shine. Won't let Satan blow it out. Shine all over my neighborhood, and a variety of other verses that we often tacked on. It's a great little song for children, but also for adults, letting our light shine for Christ in this world. And that's the challenge of this particular lesson, is to let our light shine in the world and be the salt of the earth, and to do all of that for the glory of God. Well, Jesus begins in verse 13 of chapter 5 by telling his disciples, you are the salt of the earth. Why would Jesus compare his disciples to salt? Well, I did a little research and discovered it's a very valuable commodity in this world, has been for centuries. It's a lot more than just that little salt shaker on our tables. Of course, there's a lot of salt in the sea and seawater, but also there are large deposits of salt on the earth, which humans have mined over the centuries because they saw the value of salt. Earliest salt mines we know about were in China in 6000 BC, and then by 3000 BC, Egyptians were using it for mummification and also for food preservation. I learned that sometimes it was even used for currency. Roman soldiers sometimes got paid in salt. So that's where we get our word salary from, because the Latin word for salt is sal. A lot of trade that took place with salt in the ancient world. Cities grew up around the mines and the trade routes, like the city of Salisbury in Europe. Or there was also the salt roads that, like the one in Italy called Via Salaria. Salt production was a big deal and a source of course, national power, and sometimes even caused wars. Can you imagine? Over salt. Salt taxes in the 1700s is one of the reasons for the French Revolution. And if we look in the Old Testament, we'll discover that many of the sacrifices are prescribed to have salt along with them. So why is salt so valuable? Well, for one thing, I learned that salt is essential to human health. We need it for nerve and muscle function and for regulating fluids in our bodies. And if we have too much of it, that's not good. If we have too little of it, that's not good. Salt has its healing quality. It acts kind of like an antiseptic in a way. It promotes tissue growth. It also, of course, preserves food by drawing out the moisture in the food and thus fighting bacteria and mold. It also, of course, gives great flavor to food. When we put it on, it kind of enhances that flavor. So how are disciples of Jesus like salt? Well, you might discuss that and think about that a little bit more. Is it that we make the world a little healthier? We bring healing to the wounds of this world. We preserve what is good by fighting the infection and rot in this world. And is it perhaps that we add flavor of Christ to this world? How do disciples do this? How do we go about that? Well, you may notice the context of Jesus' statement. It actually comes exactly after the Beatitudes, where he described the character of his disciples. And that's what we studied last week, these characteristics of being poor in spirit, meek, hungering for thirst and thirsting for righteousness, showing mercy, being pure in heart, being peacemakers. Yeah, these characteristics are exactly like the characteristics of Jesus, and they impact the world like Jesus did. So we are the salt of the earth when we live like Jesus lived in this world, and it makes a difference. Notice also, just for a moment, what Jesus said: if the salt loses its saltiness, how can it be salty again? Technically, sodium chloride, which is salt, always has a salty taste. But in Jesus' day, most of the salt, or a lot of the salt, came from the Dead Sea, which of course was mixed with many, many other minerals. And once the sodium chloride dissolved, there was no more salt taste to that salt. If the characteristics of Jesus' disciples, I think is what he's saying, if their characteristics no longer are distinctive from the world, then their effect on the world is indeed lost. So the truth is, the world needs salty Christians. Well, Jesus also said that the disciples were the light of the world. Why do you think Jesus compared his disciples to light? What's the value of light? Well, this might be a little easier for us. Helps us to see our surroundings much better. Shows us where we can walk if we're looking for a path to walk on, the right one. Or it also shows us things that we might want to avoid and stepping on. So, do you remember this, though, that Jesus said, I am the light of the world in the Gospel of John, among his many other I am sayings? But here he says, you are the light of the world. Even emphatically, he says, you are the light of the world. What's his point? Who's really the light of the world? Well, of course, Jesus is the light. And perhaps we might think about it as reflecting the light, maybe kind of like the moon reflects the sun. Or maybe is it that the light shines through our lives as we reflect his character? You may remember that the title of the lesson is Being Salt, Being Light, Being Transparent. Transparency is that quality of allowing light to pass through so that objects behind it can be distinctly seen. I think that's our job, to be transparent, allowing the light of Christ to shine through our lives, his character becoming our character. Notice Jesus said that the light should not be hidden. It's like a city on a hill, or it's like a lamp that is lit and hid, or not hid, but placed on a stand, kind of like this. This actually is a replica of a oil lamp that came from the time of Jesus, dug up in an excavation over there. And you can imagine with this light, you'd want to put it up on a stand, if that's all you had, to light the darkness of the night. You wouldn't want to put a bushel over the top of it. And that's the image that Jesus gives to his disciples. Question we might ask ourselves, why would we ever want to hide our light? In what situation do we tend to do that, though? That's a good question, perhaps for us to discuss. Well, there's one more passage in this week's lesson, and it's in chapter 6 in verses 1 through 4, and it almost sounds contradictory to what Jesus said about salt and light. He says, be careful not to practice righteousness in front of others to be seen by them. What? I thought he just said that we're supposed to let our light shine. And he did. But notice what else he said in chapter 5, verse 16. He said, here's the reason to let your light shine, so that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven. The reason for being a light in the world is to glorify God. Make God known in this world. Bring awareness to Him, not to ourselves, or not to earn points in heaven, or to mark off a checklist. No, the reason for our light shining and being salt is to show God to this world. Jesus illustrates his point by talking about giving to the poor. Giving, of course, is one of the main marks of piety for Jews, also for Christians. Giving to the poor, praying, and fasting. Those were the three. And in these verses we read about the first of these and what Jesus has to say. All three of these could be done for show, but if they're done for our gain, to gain our attention to ourselves, then he says there's no reward in heaven. You've already got it. How do you avoid doing good things for show? Well, Jesus suggests do them in secret. Don't let the right hand know what the left hand is doing, which, by the way, is easier the older you get. And he also suggests do it for God and no one else. As our lesson writer said, have an audience of one. Do it for God. Whatever you do, whether in word or deed, do it all in the name of Jesus, the Apostle Paul said in Colossians. Don't worry then also, I'd suggest, what others think or don't think. And maybe you can think of some other ways to avoid doing good things, just to gain attention to ourselves and not to God. Well, today you may notice that in social media they talk a lot about influencers. They influence styles, food, politics, whatever. Lots of hits on their social media. And of course, the main thing about an influencer, he wants to be noticed. She wants to be noticed. But Jesus challenges us to be influencers for Him in everyday life without being noticed and by bringing awareness to Him. The question that we might ask ourselves if we get down to the nitty-gritty of applying these words is to ask ourselves, how could I be salt for people in the world that I find myself this week? Can I be a healing presence to the wounds of this world, of preserving the good, flavoring the conversation with God? Or how could I be light in places where I go, helping people see more clearly, see the world as it really is, to see the right path that they might take and things to avoid? And maybe ask this question, how can I ensure God gets the glory for whatever I do? How could I do something about drawing attention away from myself and toward God? May the Lord help us as we go about this week being salt and light for Him in this world.